Hey, welcome back. On this journey to read a book from an author from every country in the world, I've picked up a good list of about 15 authors who I really want to explore more of their work. They've intrigued me or moved me in some particular way. So here's the thing. Imagine them as like crew members, right? I'm the captain of this giant ship. And for some reason, you good people subscribe to me and become passengers on this ship that is journeying around the literary world. And we are reading all these books. Some of you jump off at certain islands, and some of you are barely paying attention, and that's totally fine. I appreciate anyone who's subscribing and watching. Like I said, I am a zany captain who has no idea what he's doing, so I just pick up these crew members who seem interesting to me, and you're kind of just going to be stuck with them going forward as I continue to read them. But I will be alternating, continuing to advance through the countries at a good rate. Every maybe 1, 2, or 3 countries we advance, I will do a video for an author that I've already covered that I just want to read more of their works of. So this is also a great opportunity for me to shout out a channel that I've been following for a long time, almost since I started this channel. It was when I was researching Ismail Kadare, and I came across Jerry at the channel Old Man and the Read. And it helped me to watch his video on Ismail Kadare, not only to help me choose which books I wanted to read by this great Albanian author, but he also had a list of videos of other authors from around the world that, like Selma Lagerlöf from Sweden, who I'll be reading very soon, and a number of others that I've covered on this channel already. So watching his videos has helped me find and select works by other authors, and he's always got interesting and charming videos coming out. So I'll link his channel in the description so you can check out Jerry at The Old Man and the Read. So with that, I'm going to talk about Ismail Kadare's Broken April. And back in October and September, I read The General of the Dead Army by Ismail Kadare, which is the first book he ever wrote. So this was published in, I believe, the 1960s. Yeah, 1963. So Broken April comes about 20 years later. The General of the Dead Army is one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And I'll link to that video in the description. I forgot if I already said that. This book made me reflect not only on war and themes of what do the dead leave behind. It made me reflect on actually this whole Reading the World project and what it's like to be reading literature from people who have passed on. And I feel like I had kind of a haunting reflection going back and watching that video now upon myself doing this Reading the World project. So I think my captain of the boat metaphor is a much more hopeful and lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek outlook, of course. I hope you'll agree if you do watch that. But now, on to Broken April. When I finished reading it, I looked up some things about Ismail Kadare and learned that he actually very recently passed away. It was like, I think, a week or 2 weeks ago. And I was kind of moved and affected by it, and also kind of struck by the coincidence that without knowing, I had decided to read another book by him. This is one that somebody on the video for General of the Dead Army had actually recommended me to read, and I had already kind of had it in mind because I've heard that this is really his classic. A lot of people consider this his greatest work. And I really enjoyed it. I flew through it, okay? Like, it took me 2 days to read this. It was one that I just couldn't put down, and I think my experience reading The General of the Dead Army was very similar. This book is about the George, or I don't really know how you pronounce his name, it's G-J-O-R-G, but it kind of looks like George to me, so I'm just going to call him that. George is, right at the beginning of the book, kills a man. The book is really about, at its core, the long tradition and custom of blood feuds in Albania. But it is told in an immensely personal way from the perspective of just a few characters. And there are some parts in the middle where it feels like it almost becomes like the book itself becomes a philosophical work on the nature of these sorts of traditions. And it's actually quite relevant to the fact, well, I felt there was a lot I could connect from my recent reading of the Popol Vuh, which is an ancient Mayan text that by fortune we are able to read today, and it's just about the only pre-Columbian work we have to read today. So check out that video too if you're interested in that. But what that got me in thinking about was the way different societies, that people in different societies have viewed death. And like in the case of the Mayans, you have like the human sacrifice, which to us seems very strange and barbaric, which is of course an erroneous thing to think, because in, you know, our Western societies we had all sorts of barbarous traditions and things that we did. Let's not look further than witch burnings, for example. But then we have like this Albanian society where these generations long cycles of blood feuds just continue, and more people as time goes on kind of seem to get wrapped up in them. So it's essentially, it's quite hard to describe, like all of the intricacies. There are so many intricacies to this blood feud, but basically George is killing a man that killed his brother, and his family got involved in it because somebody killed a guest at their home. So there are all these rules that sort of regulate this blood feud. And it's essentially a government. It's a government for this early 20th century rural mountainous country that seems really to not have a lot of strong political oversight in many of its areas, but at the same time, everyone seems to report to this prince and a blood secretary, or I forget exactly what his name is, Steward of the Blood, who seem to have a very almost and it's somewhat comparable to like pre-Columbian societies in the Americas, where like religion and government are kind of the same thing. This blood feud is almost to the point of being a religion. It's a culture in which shame and the fear of shame is always greater than the fear of death. And so many people die young because of these blood feuds. They continue and they seem senseless to outsiders, but we get a very nuanced exploration in this book through the characters about how for some people these blood feuds actually give meaning to life, and then for others their lives are senselessly destroyed by them. And there's plenty here to criticize as well, but we are, just like in General of the Dead Army, in a situation where we have a general going to Albania to dig up the bodies and return the bodies of his country from Albania. We have a very nuanced, we are left not really with answers. We have to figure out those answers ourselves. And that's one of my favorite things about Ismail Kadare. And just like in General of the Dead Army, Albania is kind of represented as the land of the dead. It is not a purgatory, it is an underworld that's actually at the top of the world because it's on high mountains and a high plateau. There's even a quote that I'll get to in here directly because of that. So the first chapter, we get simply the killing. And George now will have 30 days of respite where he goes and has according to ritual, he goes to the house of the man he murdered, has dinner with their family after the funeral, and now he has 30 days before they are allowed to send somebody to take revenge for the murder. And of course, this is all cyclical, all ritual. I started taking notes as I went through the book, and it's funny because it happened very spontaneously. I don't take marginalia in every book I read, but I was just simply compelled to start doing it in this one as I was reading through it. And the very first one was recognizing this sort of language that Kadare uses that evokes a memory, a dream, and the psyche of his father, whose heart is completely cold and thinks only of completing this cycle of tradition that he's always known as well. And he says it, he could not put out of mind that icy morning in January when his father had called him to the great room on the upper story of the house. They could talk privately. The day was particularly bright. The sky and new-fallen snow were dazzling. The world shone like glass, and with a kind of crystal madness it seemed that it might begin to slip at any moment and shatter into thousands of fragments. And this is not the only time in this book that I'm going to be reminded of the Crystal World by J.G. Ballard, I believe. I believe it's the Crystal World, something with crystals, but I read that a long time ago, and this idea, you know, this idea of like these crystals, beautiful, dazzling crystals kind of taking over all organic life. And it seems like a strong symbol too for how these blood feuds start to consume entire families, entire villages, and even possibly an entire nation. And here again, in this very conversation that George remembers with his father, we realize that the fear of shame is greater than the fear of death, as his father points out the shirt hanging on the clothesline, which is the bloody shirt of his brother, which is starting to turn yellow, and this means he's waiting too long. This is, of course, a memory George is having before he killed the man. Now, George reflects on what if he had never been pulled into this blood feud. He says, now he felt he could not say which life was better, a quiet life dusted over with forgetfulness and excluded from the machinery of the blood feud, or that other life, the life of danger, but with a lightning bolt of grief that ran through it like a quivering seam. He had tasted both, and if someone had said to him now, choose one or the other, George would certainly have hesitated. Perhaps it took years to get used to peace, just as it had taken so many years to get used to its absence. The mechanism of the blood feud was such that even as it freed you, it kept you bound to it in spirit for a long time. And now what is really fascinating is that October, just like in General of the Dead Army, is referenced many times in past tense in this book. And I can't help but thinking that there is a direct connection between Broken April and the General of the Dead Army. And any time October is mentioned, there is a very close reference to the General of the Dead Army. There's a wedding, a bunch of people who died that were at a wedding, the grave of a wedding party, which, if you've read the General of the Dead Army, you know there's a very important wedding scene in that book. So there are connections, and once again, Ismail Kadare really uses the seasons of transition, fall and spring, as kind of creating, once again, I'm going to bring up that concept of the liminal space. So this sort of in between, this transition space, not only between the seasons, but between life and death. Just that in General the Dead Army, it was October, and in Broken April, it is spring, March and April. So we'll continue. So George, one of the main events of the story then is George is traveling to the castle where the prince and the blood steward are to pay his blood tax, which is something every killer everyone involved in these blood feuds must do if they have killed or injured somebody. They must go to this castle and pay a blood tax. It is not only a cultural system of the country, it is an economic system, and that is talked about in the book as well. Now, chapter 3. This was quite jarring for me, and almost made me think I wasn't going to like this book as much as General of the Dead Army. I was wrong, but I was questioning at chapter 3 because we completely break away from George's story when he arrives at the castle where the prince and the blood steward are. And we start now following a writer who I'm not quite sure of what national origin he is, but he is a writer, a journalist who has written before about the blood feuds, and or the blood law, we can also call it. So he is traveling with his wife to Albania, and actually whoever owned this book before me made a ton of notes just in this chapter of the book about the relationship between this writer, Besjen Vorpsi, and his wife. And so whoever had this book before me was really focused just on their relationship, and it's a troubled relationship where his wife is kind of rejecting him. Mrs. Vorpsi is kind of she's reluctantly accepting his advances, but there's clearly a sort of emotional rift between them. And once again, there is this idea that they are in an in-between space as they are traveling to Albania. The mountains, properly speaking, had not yet begun, but one felt their looming shadow, and it seemed that it was that very shadow which, while rejecting any connection between the plateau and the mountain world, kept it from being classed as a plain. And whoever had this book before me wrote that this symbolizes their relationship, while I say it symbolizes what Albania is as a whole. But it's really, well, Albania itself is the underworld in Ismail Kadare's writing, and this transition space is the transition space from the real world to the underworld. So then we continue here. They go into Albania, and this is a really kind of slow part of the book. I couldn't stop reading, but this part I had to kind of push through a little bit. They kind of make several stops, and they talk to some different people about the concepts. They see, for example, people traveling with the black ribbons on their arm, which signals that they are either a marked man or a murderer involved in this blood feud. I think just like in General of the Dead Army, there is a reference to the Greek the Greek proportions of the journey that is going into Albania. Yes, he said, we have entered Death's kingdom like Ulysses, with this difference. Ulysses had to descend in order to reach it, but we must climb. And so we continue on where there are some long conversations with like innkeepers, and between Diana is his wife's name. Mrs. Vorsby is Diana. So Diana is talking to Besjen, and they are kind of disagreeing or going back and forth. Diana cannot grasp any sort of acceptance of the blood feud, whereas Besjen is, he has a more nuanced view, having been someone who wrote about it. Yeah, I'm gonna kind of go quickly through this section. There's a lot more notes about how this whole section is kind of about their, yeah, this sort of strange relationship. They're almost like magnets of opposing ends, where they can't, they're opposing charges. They just can't come together, even though it seems like maybe she she's accepting or trying, and then he's accepting or trying. It must symbolize something, and maybe that's what this person was getting at as they were writing something about this. But I wasn't quite able to connect the symbolism of Beshin and Diana's relationship to the other themes in the story. It's something that I guess, what do you think if you've read it? I'm curious to what, maybe there's something obvious that I'm missing here. It was rather a certain detachment or the first stage of a kind of estrangement from him. It could be something to do with the relationship between a changing or modernizing possible Albania of the future and now where they are, the blood feud is finding some contradictions in modernization, and it gets into that a little bit later in the book. I can't quite articulate it yet. I'm curious to what other people think, though. So chapter 4 gets back. Actually, we go into the head of the Steward of Blood, kind of the right-hand man of the prince, Mark Uka Sierra, who, his job is to look after the business of the blood tax. He collects the blood tax, he keeps track of how many killings there are per year, and in his opinion, more blood law killings are a good thing. It means more money, it means the tradition is continuing, and he is quite horrified that as it happens, the day that George shot his man, and it was actually kind of unlikely that that day George was going to shoot his man, which is explained in one part, but he did it. On that day, it is the only killing, and so this Steward of Blood, Mark Uka Sierra, is horrified that a day almost happened in which there was no blood killing. This is almost unheard of, he says. This, going back generations and centuries or whatever, he imagines that and has no record of there ever being a single day without a killing. And we get a strange world vision from Mark Uka Sierra, a world vision that seems enlightened, where one sees one's enemies as valuable as allies. And actually this comes from the prince, not Mark Uka Sierra, because the prince keeps in his library things written about the blood law that also speak against the blood law. So it's a very interesting thing that the ruler, the prince, is kind of, maybe it shows that he is more open-minded, and considering that the blood law needs to be relaxed and less people need to be killing each other in this early 20th century Albania. Remember, it's very important to remember the time period that this takes place in. I also should mention, I do not know how 100% historically accurate this is. I didn't look into it, but in no way could you call this book a kind of magical realism. But what reading this did kind of make me think of is like reading science fiction dystopias. The culture seemed so strange and so violent in a way that I couldn't understand, that it really almost made me feel like I was reading a science fiction utopia, which I read a lot more, or dystopia, which I read a lot more of when I was younger. But it's very, to me, this is why I say I'm not really that into science fiction, because you can find a lot of great literature about real world stuff that is crazier than anything I've really, and it's believable because it's based on something that really happened, than to go into the science fiction and fantasy realms. I'm not dismissing those genres entirely. I'm just saying that it is very hard for me to find a convincing science fiction or fantasy work when there are works like this, which make the real seem so strange and mythic. So, and Mark Uka Sierra, he has this hatred for... Now, this is what's interesting. Beshin and Diana arrive at this very same castle where George is waiting to pay his blood tax, where the Steward of Blood, Mark Uka Sierra, is is there having all of these thoughts, and he, observing Diana, this city woman, she is flashy, gorgeous, attracts a lot of attention, and so he looks at her and actually calls her a witch in one moment, and says that she represents a lust for life, which is what he's implying here, is that a lust for life is the enemy of the blood tax. This is a culture that almost worships death, and I'm not making necessarily a value judgment on that. It's the book certainly has a lot to both represent it and criticize it. So, but you can tell Marco Cassierra's focus is really, in some sense, on the revenue that is not being generated. And there's a conversation that follows pretty shortly in the next chapter where, in fact, an economist, or it's not quite the next chapter, but chapter 6, where we'll get to that in a moment. But first, we are going back to George. George is he is basically waiting for his last. He's waiting for his time to be up. His 30 days are about to end. We get some of his thoughts as he's approaching this, and then in chapter 6, Beshin and Diana actually come near to the tower where George is staying, and this is in the past again, so the time of this book is a little flipped around. Diana actually goes into the tower, and something happens which is never revealed, but she is not the same after coming back. And she wasn't supposed to go in there in the first place. Beshin is trying to understand what happened there. Why did you go in? Why did you do this? And then in chapter 7, we get the end of the book, which I'm not going to state exactly what happens, but it is one of those it is an ending that symbolizes the cyclical nature of this blood feud. And once again, just like General of the Dead Army, leaves us with more questions than answers. And that's one reason I love Ismail Kadare. Even though he may, I don't quite know, but he may have had different political outlooks than these other two authors, I kind of put him in the same space of my brain as Jose Maria Arguedas of Peru and Yeshar Kemal of Turkey. These three authors were all kind of contemporaries of each other, roughly, mid to 3/4 through the 20th centuries when they did most of their writing. And they all kind of write about cultures that up to their point were little understood by the world outside, and they bring us nuanced and very profound perspectives. They have great descriptions of landscapes, there's a lot of similarities between these authors, a deep sensitivity, but yet each one has their own flavor. So I think I've kind of revealed two other authors that I'm going to be exploring more in depth. All three of these crossing quite a space of distance. We have Peru, Albania, and Turkey and specifically in the case of Yeshar Kemal, we're talking Kurdish, southern Anatolia, so that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the cultures that the world wasn't really aware of. They brought out the concerns and the lifestyles of these cultures, and all of them are like rural, mountain, plateau type cultures as well. So yeah, a lot of similarities between these three authors. Once again, really saddened and about the passing of Ismail Kadare, and I hope this video has helped pique interest in his work, Broken April, as well as General of the Dead Army. This was kind of a one-take thing, so I hope it was enlightening. I hope it was all right. But I'm just going to post it, and we're going to move on with our journey, sailing the boat around the world. Thanks for joining and subscribing. Take care. We'll see you next time on Mike Reads the World.